Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people here this afternoon. I'm really pleased, thank you. So it just remains for me to give Derek McIntyre of Jesus the Evidence Ministries a welcome, and if you can all give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, very nice of you. Thank you very much. Right. So what we're going to do today is, you'll have seen from the promotional material, what we're going to talk about is the historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God. Was his life, death, and resurrection actual historical events? So I'd like to start by putting two statements up on the screen. There's a historical and a rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God, and there's a wealth of evidence to support that view. And I guess the purpose of today is to provide an introduction to that historical and rational evidence and draw some conclusions from the evidence presented. Clearly, in one session, we're not going to be able to cover these topics in forensic detail. The pile of books you see on my former front lounge carpet are just a fraction of the books currently available on this topic. So, firstly, an apology if I seem to be skipping over certain topics you'd like to explore more deeply. There'll be an opportunity at the end to ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them as honestly and as fully as I can. Also, at the end of the presentations, you'll get this booklet, this goes into all the topics we're going to cover in far more depth than we can in two presentations. So you'll get a copy of this booklet at the end of. You only get them at the end because I don't want to give them out just now and everybody disappear. Right. So the plan is we're going to review the sources of evidence for Jesus that are available to us, and I guess more importantly, we'll ask whether these sources are reliable or not. After that, we'll spend some time looking at the picture of Jesus that emerges from these sources. After a short break for tea and coffee, we'll spend the rest of the presentation looking at the available evidence for the resurrection. Each half of the presentation will last about 40 minutes, and as I say, you'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Good. So I thought it'd be useful to start off with by telling you a wee bit about myself, should I say. I'm a Christian, however, I used to be an agnostic. I guess I would have classified myself as a resolute agnostic. I really thought you couldn't know for definite anything about God or Jesus. And you couldn't know one way or the other. That's what I thought. I guess I discussed religious matters with my friends in my teens, my early 20s, but never came to any clear conclusions. I guess I parked the big questions on God and Jesus in a file in the back of my head with a view to thinking about them later, but never did. I would never have classified myself as an atheist because I realised that atheism is a faith position. I really thought you couldn't know for definite one way or the other. So through my 20s and 30s, I guess I had the view of many people in the UK today that I really didn't know what to think about God or Jesus. I suppose I probably thought you needed to have some sort of faith to be a Christian, and frankly that faith was for other people. People maybe who'd been brought up Christians, or perhaps people who had experienced some form of life-changing spiritual experience. Well, frankly, neither situation applied to me. However, in my late 30s, I thought it would be useful revisiting some of the questions I'd left unresolved in my teens. My thoughts were there are plenty of capable, intelligent people who profess to have some sort of belief in God. For example, scientists like Albert Einstein and Francis Collins, ex-head of the US Genome Project. Other example I saw were politicians like Nelson Mandela, military men like Norman Schwarzkopf and Richard Dannett, and so on. I remember reading a survey in Nature in 1997 that said 4 out of 10 scientists said they believed in God. Okay, just over 45% said they didn't believe, and 14.5% described themselves as doubters or agnostics. However, a figure of 40% surprised me. Well, why did they believe? Also, if I looked at the religious leaders in the UK, they were clearly intelligent men and women. If these people had some sort of belief in God, then perhaps it was worthwhile looking at this again to try and find out why. Now, at this time, these things were rattling around my head. I was on a business trip to the USA, and I was sitting in the back of a car between Cleveland, Ohio, and Erie, Pennsylvania. It's about a 90-mile journey. I was going to be in this car for about an hour and a half, and I was sitting next to a colleague who was from California. I'm trying to be polite, as you would if you're sitting next to somebody. I asked him where he'd been on holiday that year, and he told me, I'd been over to the UK on missionary work. I didn't think they sent missionary. Oxford in the UK. Oxford in the UK and missionary work. I didn't think they sent missionaries to Oxford. Well, there you are. They apparently do from California. As you might imagine, that sparked my curiosity, as it was, of course, fully intended to, and the conversation turned to spiritual matter. The upshot of the conversation was that he'd send me a few books that might help with the questions I had. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I received a copy of The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel and a Bible. Now, did reading The Case for Christ turn me into a Christian? Well, no, it didn't. But what it did, though, was act as a starting point into my own investigation into who Jesus is. Frankly, I was amazed at what I found. I was amazed at my own ignorance of the evidence I found. How can I be living in a Christian country and not be aware of this stuff? So the reason I'm presenting today is that I kind of think it's important to share the information I found with others and allow them to draw their own conclusions. Anyway, enough of me. Let's get into the meat of the presentation. So, when you read the booklet you'll get at the end of the presentation, you'll see that about half of it is devoted to reviewing the sources of evidence we have for Jesus and assessing how reliable those sources are. For today, I've tried to provide a very brief summary of this. So, what are the sources that we've got for Jesus? Well, we've got before I go on, that's right. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's one question I'd just like to deal with. Now, plenty of people out there think that Jesus never existed. He was mythical. Maybe some people in here think that, I don't know. But that's not the view of today's historians that specialise in this period of history. I pulled this straight off Wikipedia. Excuse me. It says, the historicity of Jesus is the question of not whether or not Jesus, the central figure of Christianity, historically existed, as opposed to being purely mythical figure. Virtually all scholars of antiquity argue that Jesus existed. The contrary perspective, that Jesus was mythical, is regarded as a fringe theory. So, basically what I'm saying is that historians that specialise in this period of history are all agreed that, the majority of them are agreed that Jesus actually existed. And they've got good reason for thinking that. And here's a statement by a guy called Bart Ehrman. I don't know if any of you know who Bart Ehrman is. Okay, but a few of you do. He's a prominent Jesus scholar in America, but he's also an agnostic. And he wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? And he wrote in the book, whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. So, I think we can take that as read. Jesus did exist. The question we're really focusing on today, is he who he said he was? Is he the Son of God? So what sources of evidence have we got for Jesus? Right, okay, go on. 4 Gospels in the Bible. Letters of Paul, James, and Jude in the Bible. The Gospels of Jesus that didn't make it into the Bible, often called the Apocryphal Gospels. We've got written sources from outside the Bible dated to shortly after Jesus' life. We've got archaeological evidence, and we have circumstantial evidence. Now, I think the most often overlooked is that last one, circumstantial evidence. I'd like to think about this for a minute. So, Christianity has existed on this planet for a very long time. Christianity has more followers today than any other religion on earth. However, we know there was a time when there were no Christians on this planet. So why are there Christians today? Well, rational cause and effect tells us that at some point in the past, something must have happened, some cause, that had the effect of compelling some people who weren't Christians to become the first Christians. Now that sounds like stating the obvious, I suppose. But for all of us, atheists, agnostics, Christians, those of other faiths, that provides a direct challenge. Cause and effect tells us that the start of Christianity is a historical event. So, when and why Christianity started can be studied like any other historical event. Historians of all faiths and no faith have been doing this very thing for about 200 years. The key point we mustn't lose sight of is that something pretty momentous must have happened to compel the first Christians to become Christians. Something must have happened to start it all in the first place, and given all the historical research that's been directed to finding out what happened, all of us, you, me, can come to our own informed view of what we think happened. So let's have a very brief look at the sources historians use for their research. Let's start with the Gospels. Okay, right, when I was an agnostic, I thought the 4 Gospels in the Bible were theological texts written hundreds of years after the time Jesus was supposed to have lived, and the Gospels we read today were substantially revised and doctored versions of what had probably been written in the first place. In other words, they couldn't be used as the basis for historical research on Jesus. That's what I thought. I was surprised to find that the general view amongst today's historians that specialise in this period of history was very, very different. The current view is the Gospel of Mark in the Bible was written around AD 60 to 70. That's about 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. With the Gospels of Matthew and Luke written around 10 years after Mark. And the Gospel of John written around 90 AD. I was surprised to find that there are many thousands of early Gospel manuscripts, some from as early as the 2nd century AD, that exist today. I was also surprised to find that when these manuscripts are compared using a technique that historians use called textual criticism, it's found that these documents look to be pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. In other words, historians are of the view that the Gospels haven't been substantially altered, either deliberately to fit in with later theology or accidentally as part of the handwritten copying process to produce documents before the invention of printing in the Middle Ages. Okay, so historians can tell us that the Gospels are pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. But are the Gospels accurate descriptions of what actually happened? Well, the answer in part comes from the dates the Gospels were written. The first Gospel, Mark, as I said, was written 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. Now, life expectancy was shorter in those days. However, when the Gospels were written, there would still be a very good chance that some of the people who had actually seen and heard Jesus would still be alive. In short, there'll still be first-hand witnesses for Jesus' life available to draw upon for information, and of course to challenge what was written down if it was inaccurate. Also, a span of 30 to 40 years really doesn't give much time for legends and myths to develop about Jesus. There's a general rule amongst historians that the longer the time span between an event occurring and it being written about, the greater the chances of legend material getting into the narrative. The 30 to 40 year time span with Jesus is, in historical terms, pretty short. For example, the earliest biographies we have, for comparison, the earliest biographies we have of Alexander the Great were written more than 400 years after his death. They were written by Arrian and Plutarch. These are the biographies that we base our knowledge of Alexander the Great upon. So, from a historian's perspective, there's a very good chance that the Gospels are pretty accurate descriptions of Jesus' life, given they were written very shortly after the actual events being described. Okay, but what about the differences in the Gospels? Now, it's well known there are some apparent differences in the Gospel, in the details in the Gospels. I'm saying apparent because these differences can be explained away, but I suppose it would be simpler if they weren't there, so you didn't have to explain them away. But anyway, I'll give you a couple of examples. The number of people that find Jesus' tomb empty varies between the Gospels. The detail of the birth narrative varies between the Gospels. There isn't a birth narrative at all in Mark's Gospel or John's Gospel. The order of some of the events of Jesus' life varies from Gospel to Gospel. In one Gospel, we find Jesus' mother Mary being told clearly that she was about to give birth to the Son of God. Yet in another Gospel, we're told that Jesus' mother and family tried to stop him in his ministry, saying that it was out of his mind. Odd behaviour if you knew your son was God's son. Also, it's well known that the style and content of John's Gospel, that is the one written last, is quite different and more theologically developed, if you like, than the other three. Does that not reduce the credibility of the information in that Gospel? Well, extensive analysis of the Gospels by historians over the last couple of hundred years has led to the consensus view that the Gospels are written at least semi-independently of each other and were drawing from oral histories of more than one early Christian community. Unsurprisingly, then, there'll be slight variations, There'll be slight variations in these oral histories, and that would be reflected in the Gospels. Also, as John's Gospel was written once Christianity and Christian theology was more developed, it's unsurprising that is reflected in the content of John's Gospel. However, what I think is surprising is that these differences exist in the Bibles we read today. What this clearly tells us is that these awkward differences have been left in, lending evidential weight to the view that the Gospels we read today are accurate versions of what was originally written. Well, that's all I'm going to say about Gospel reliability. We'll go into it in far more depth in the booklet you'll get at the end of the presentation. Let's move on to Paul's letters. Now, another source of evidence we can use for Jesus, as I say, are the letters that the early Christian apostle Paul wrote to various early Christian communities in Rome and other locations in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, these were written 15 to 25 years after Jesus died, so all Paul's letters predate the Gospels. And there's a consensus view amongst historians that the majority of the letters of Paul in the Bible were genuinely written, well, probably more accurately dictated by Paul himself. In the letters, there's clear evidence that Christian worship and belief were already well developed. Logic tells us this must have happened earlier than 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. Now, one example of this is a passage from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is one of the letters that historians are confident was actually written by Paul. Now, I should say, they've got the letters, Paul's letters. There's a core of letters that are the historians have a consensus view were actually written by Paul. But that's not to mean the others are forgeries. It just means there's more historical debate about it. But there's no debate about 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So it says, Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you've received and on which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you're saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and then he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. Okay, why is that passage important? Well, as I mentioned before, Paul's letter to the Corinthians is regarded by historians as genuine. The passage we've just seen and heard is also regarded by historians as genuine. In other words, it doesn't look like a later addition. Of course, what it shows is that at least as early as 15 to 25 years after Jesus died, and of course most likely earlier than that, the central message of Christianity was the death and resurrection of Jesus and what it meant. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Paul's letters today. We're going into far more depth in the booklet you'll get at the end of the presentation. Let's move on to the apocryphal Gospels. Now, there are many other accounts, Gospels if you like, of Jesus' life that aren't in the Bible. Some of these other Gospels have survived to the present day and are available for both historians and the general public to read and study. Now, you might have heard about 10 years ago, archaeologists dug up the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. This is one of the many other Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, and so on. These apocryphal Gospels, as they are known, were written well into the 2nd century AD or later. They often contain more fanciful and supernatural accounts of Jesus' life, just as historians might expect from that rule of thumb I described a minute ago. That is, the longer the time period between an event occurring and it being written about, the greater the chances of legendary material getting into the narrative. Now, historians do use the apocryphal Gospels for study on the life of Jesus. However, they're probably more useful for study of the beliefs of the 2nd and 3rd century Christian communities that they sprung from. Okay, that's all I want to say about the apocryphal Gospels today. Let's move on to contemporary non-Christian written sources. Now, a reasonable question to ask is, why are there no surviving documents describing Jesus' life from non-Christian sources from the time of Jesus? The argument goes, if the events of Jesus' life were so momentous, why were they not written about by other writers at the time? Although we don't ultimately know for certain why that is, we suggest that the likely answer is rather mundane if we consider who might have recorded this. That is, the Jewish, Roman, or Greek scribes writing for the Jewish or Roman authorities. From a Jewish and Roman authorities' perspective, I think Jesus would be seen as just another Jewish holy man who stirred up the Jews in Jerusalem and was quickly dealt with before he could cause any real trouble. These events were occurring in a tiny part of the Roman Empire where this kind of thing happened regularly. I think it would have been hardly worthy of a mention. And what I wanted to do with this slide, when I was putting this together, I wanted to find out what was going on in the Roman Empire about the time of Jesus' mission. And as you can see, there was quite a lot. For one, they were fighting these blokes up here. Now, how do you pronounce that? I've been pronouncing it Dacians for the last 20 years, but then I found out there's a car called or something. What do you reckon? Thank you. Right, is that how you pronounce it? Well, okay, right. Well, the Romans were fighting these unpronounceable blokes up here, and they were fighting the Germanic tribes up there, and this was a major thing going on in the Roman Empire. It was basically the Emperor Tiberius had gone into semi-retirement And he retired to Capri and put de facto control of the empire in the hands of this bloke, Sejanus. He was the head of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus then appointed a whole series of placemen around the empire that were loyal to Sejanus. Now, it looks like Pontius Pilate was one of them. In about AD 31, Tiberius reckoned that Sejanus was getting a bit too big for his boots, so had him murdered and had his entire family murdered. And of course, that put all his placemen in a rather difficult position. And that might explain why Pontius Pilate acts the way he does in John's Gospel. Pontius Pilate really was a terrible man, and he rarely paid attention to what anyone said. But interestingly enough, the Jewish authorities say to him, if you let this man live, if this man claims to be king of the Jews, pointing to Jesus, we've only got one king, but King Caesar. If you let this man live, you're no friend of Caesar's. And unsurprisingly, he has him executed. So that might have something to do with the way Pontius Pilate behaves in John's Gospel. We can maybe talk about that later. Anyway, I think you'll agree that all these things, the financial crisis, the fighting of the Germanic, these are all far more important from a Roman perspective than some itinerant Jewish preacher in the bottom right-hand corner of your empire causing a bit of trouble who was quickly dealt with before he could cause any real trouble. Now, if the Jewish scribes had written about Jesus, the documents would have had to survive the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70 and AD 135. Now, I won't go into the details of the Jewish uprisings at that time and the Roman response, other than to say that the Romans ultimately flattened the city, destroyed the temple completely, and killed or scattered the Jewish inhabitants. Really not ideal conditions for the survival of documents, particularly in Jewish eyes, the less sacred non-Christian documents. Well, is that it? Well, no. Although there are no reliable documents describing Jesus' life from outside the Bible, there are a number of non-Christian documents describing Jesus' early followers. In the booklet, we provide a more extensive review of these documents and what they say. However, for today, I just want to focus on one reference, that is Tacitus. Now, in 115 AD, Tacitus wrote a history of Rome, and he describes how Nero persecuted Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Well, what does that admittedly brief mention of Christians tell us? Well, one thing it tells us is that there were sufficient numbers of people who saw themselves as Christians in Rome in 64 AD to be singled out for attention by Nero. Now, if you think about this, to be a persecuted minority, there have to be sufficient numbers of that minority to come to the attention of the majority. To use a contemporary example, consider asylum seekers in the UK. There have been people seeking asylum in the UK for hundreds of years. However, they've only begun to be seen as a group called asylum seekers when their numbers grew significantly around the turn of the millennium. So the reference in Tacitus tells us that less than 35 years after Jesus' death, there was a Christian community large enough and vocal enough to be noticed by the emperor and worthy of persecution in Rome. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that for today. As I say, we go into it in far more detail, as we also do about archaeology in the booklet. I won't spend much time other than to say archaeological finds in Galilee and Judea provide a generally supportive picture of the details that appear in Paul's letters and the Gospels. I'll just use one example here. That picture there, that's a foot bone, okay, with a nail through it. That was found in a Jewish tomb in Jerusalem, and that's a reconstruction, okay? Now, prior to that foot bone being found, if you'd asked a historian what happened to the victims of crucifixion in Jerusalem, they would have said they were exclusively thrown on the municipal rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. Of course, the finding of that foot bone in a Jewish tomb indicates that at least one person got a proper Jewish burial after he was crucified. Yeah? So, of course, that detail ties up with the details of the Gospels. Of course, that foot bone isn't Jesus, clearly, but it provides a generally corroborative piece of information for the detail that's in the Gospels. So these are the sources that historians, you and I, can draw upon to understand who Jesus was and is. So when examining the evidence, what do today's historians agree upon regarding the life of Jesus? Well, when I was doing my research into who Jesus is, I read a book by the historian Professor E.P. Sanders called The Historical Figure of Jesus. That's the book you can see up on the right-hand side of the screen. E.P. Sanders was regarded as a leading figure on research on the historical Jesus. This particular book was written in 1993. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this book is because Sanders in it provides what he calls a few brief statements about Jesus which are almost beyond dispute from a historical perspective. These are: Jesus was born circa 4 BCE, near the time of death of Herod the Great. He spent his childhood and early adult years in Nazareth, a Galilean village. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He called disciples. He taught in the towns, villages, and countryside of Galilee, but apparently not the cities. He preached the kingdom of God. About the year 30, or 33 AD, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with his disciples, and he was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest, and he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Okay, Sanders then goes on to provide what he refers to as a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. Again, these are historical facts that the majority of today's historians are agreed actually happened after Jesus' death. These are: the disciples first fled. The disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Now, I wonder if any of you find that list surprising. I know I did when I first read it as an agnostic. I was surprised that the accepted historical view of Jesus' life and its aftermath was so close to being what I understood to be the biblical view. Now, when we look at evidence for the resurrection later on, I'll come back to this list, along with some of the circumstantial threads of evidence regarding early Christianity I've touched on so far. However, before that, I'd like to briefly look at what the sources tell us about Jesus himself. The sources indicate that Jesus' disciples thought he was the Son of God and Messiah. Well, were they correct? Okay, for an atheist and agnostic, it's hard to believe that the historical figure of Jesus is also the Son of God. So is Christianity therefore based on some massive misunderstanding of who Jesus was? Well, I'd like to take a few minutes to look at what the sources tell us about who Jesus was and is. Okay, it's sometimes suggested that although Jesus saw himself as a teacher and Jewish holy man, he didn't regard himself as the Son of God. Indeed, some have claimed that as a good Jew, Jesus would have regarded such a view of himself as blasphemous. Well, to address that question, I've picked a couple of examples from Mark's Gospel. You'll remember that from earlier on that Mark was the gospel written first, some 30 to 40 years after Jesus' death. I've chosen an example from Mark's gospel to reduce the possibility of Christian theology getting in the way of developing an accurate picture of Jesus' view of himself. Now, when we look in Mark's gospel, we can see clear evidence of Jesus thinking and acting in a manner consistent with his believing he's the Son of God. For example, in Mark's gospel, Jesus forgives sins. In the miracle narratives, Jesus sometimes links the physical or mental affliction of the person about to be healed with that person's sinfulness. For example, in Mark chapter 2, he says, "Son, your sins are forgiven," as a precursor to the healing of a paralyzed man. Now, as any good Jew knew, only God can forgive sins. Jesus knew the Jewish scriptures and teachings. In acting that way, he was directly linking himself with God. It says that the Jewish religious authorities also realized that and accused him of blasphemy as a result. In Mark's gospel, Jesus teaches on his own authority. Now, this may appear as a bit of a technicality, but in Judaism, he required two people to conduct religious teaching, one to witness what the other was saying, and vice versa. Jesus, however, makes a point of teaching alone. He precedes many of his teaching with the words, "I tell you the truth." Well, so what, you might say? Well, any other Jewish teacher in the first century would say something like, "I tell you the truth," and here's a teacher standing next to me. They'll verify I'm telling the truth. So why is that important? Well, a Jewish audience would know that only God can teach on his own authority. Again, Jesus is directly linking himself with God by teaching in that particular way. Now, in Mark's gospel, he refers to God as Father or Abba. That's Aramaic for dad or daddy. Well, so what, you might say again, isn't God regularly referred to as Father in the Christian church? It doesn't mean that God is their actual father. The Christians believe that God is their actual biological father. Now, I guess the problem here is we're used to that Christian view of having an intimate father-child relationship with God. A relationship, of course, modeled in Jesus' relationship with God. As a result, it's been common in the last 2,000 years to refer to God as Father. However, to first century Jews, calling God Father would be blasphemous. Jews weren't even allowed to mention God's name, that is the tetragram YHWH. So to refer to God as Dad or Daddy, Abba, would be seen by Jews as downright eccentric, as well as blasphemous, of course, unless, of course, you actually were God's son. Now, in Mark's Gospel, the miracles had symbolic, or some of the miracles have symbolic meaning to those that were performed in front of. They were performed in such a way as to link Jesus to such Jewish figures as Moses, Elijah, Joshua, and so on. Now, another miracle, the calming of the storm, also suggested to those who witnessed it that Jesus was God. Now, in this event, Jesus and his disciples are in an open boat on the Sea of Galilee when they're caught in a violent storm. As the wind and waves rage and the boat begins to fill with water, Jesus is sleeping at the back of the boat on a cushion. The disciples wake him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus then gets up, shouts at the waves, "Quiet, be still." At this, storm immediately abates. Jesus then gives his disciples a hard time for the lack of faith in him. At this time, Jews believed that only God had control of the elements. Further, Jews believed that Satan's home was under the waters of seas and lakes. For Jesus to take control of the wind and waves in that way was a clear sign to his followers that he was God and that he had control over Satan. No wonder the disciples were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." So in summary, I think it's fair to say these points don't provide conclusive proof that Jesus is the Son of God. However, it certainly indicates it was very likely that he thought of himself in that way. Okay, I think we'd all agree, if someone thinks today they're the Son of God, we'd think they were massively deluded. So was Jesus also severely deluded to think of himself in that particular way? Well, in the booklet, we look at what psychologists, professional psychologists, think of Jesus' mental condition when they review the sources of evidence we have. And the conclusion we come to and they come to and we come to is there's no direct evidence or even hints of evidence of Jesus exhibiting any of the behavior patterns associated with delusional behavior. Okay, it looks from the sources of evidence that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God and Messiah, and there's no clues to suggest he was massively deluded. However, what if he unintentionally misled the disciples so they believed he was the Son of God? What if he sincerely believed it, but was just wrong? Alternatively, what if he deliberately misled the disciples? What if he had some other agenda? What if all those miracles and healings were actually sleight of hand, deceptions, magic tricks, and so on? These are all reasonable questions to ask, and I'll spend a couple of minutes touching on each one individually. Let's focus on the unintentional one first of all. A few minutes ago, we discussed whether Jesus was severely deluded, mad, if you prefer, to think he was the Son of God. My guess is we're all quite comfortable with concluding it's unlikely Jesus had serious mental health problems. But what if he unintentionally misled his followers? What if he sincerely believed he was the Son of God but was just wrong? Now, this is a common argument put forward by non-Christians. To quote Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, page 92 of the hardback version, if you want to check, Richard Dawkins writes, "A fourth possibility, almost too obvious to need mentioning, is that Jesus was honestly mistaken as the Son of God. Plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things." Well, indeed, plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things. It doesn't make them mad. I've been honestly mistaken about all kinds of things in my life. However, if I stood up here right now, took off my specs, looked at you in a focused kind of way, and said, "I'm the Son of God." No, I'm not kidding. I'm the Son of God. I know it's a bit difficult to get your head around, what with this lack of hair and this wee check shirt and this accent, but I'm the Son of God. What do you think? Well, probably the politest thing you would say is, I need to probably have a wee sit down and a drink of water, so I'm going to. So what am I saying? I'm saying you can't have it both ways. If you think you're God, then you're either wrong in the head or you are God. Further, if you think you're God and are prepared to do something about it, that involves going on a mission that collects followers, challenges the established religious order, and ends up getting you and most of your followers killed, you really are wrong in the head or God. So, given what I've just said, it's pretty unlikely he unintentionally misled his followers. Could he have deliberately done that? What if all those miracles were elaborate hoaxes, hypnotism, magic tricks, sleight of hand, and so on? Now, we know of some other messianic and charismatic leaders in the past who have deliberately misled their followers. Well, these two characters up here, I take it you know who these are? Yeah, right, okay, David Koresh, head of the Branch Davidian cult at, what do you call it, in Waco in Texas, and Jim Jones. So, these people deliberately misled their followers, and they were clearly capable of a whole lot of other pretty bad things. I've put a kind of potted biography of both of them in the booklet. Read the biography yourself and do the comparison with Jesus. There's no comparison. Jesus just doesn't look like any of these characters. I think what I'm trying to get across here is if you're prepared to mislead your followers, you'll be prepared to do a whole lot of other things as well. And Jesus just doesn't look like somebody that would do that. But don't take my word for it. Read the Gospels for yourself. Read Read the potted biographies for yourself and see what you think. So, it looks like Jesus thought he was the Son of God. It looks like he wasn't mad or delusional. It's very unlikely he knowingly or unknowingly misled the disciples. So what we're left with? Well, maybe, just maybe, he was who he said he was. Now, what I'd like to do now is have a short break for a cup of tea and a cup of coffee. After the break, I'd like to move on to the one key event on which the existence of Christianity rests. That is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Is there compelling evidence to support the resurrection being an actual historical event? Thank you. Let's get going. Right, okay, so to start a look at evidence for the resurrection, I'd like to return to that list of events from Jesus' life from the historian E.P. Sanders' book, The Historical Figure of Jesus. You know, remember from earlier, we went through a list of what Sanders refers to as a list of secure facts about the life and death of Jesus and the aftermath. As I said, these are historical facts that the majority of today's historians are agreed actually happened before and after Jesus' death. Let me repeat the last few bullet points on that list. About the year 30 or 33 AD, Jesus went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with the disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest, and he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. As I said earlier, Sanders then goes on to provide what he refers to as a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. The disciples first fled. The disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Now, I guess the purpose of the remainder of today is to focus on that third last bullet point. Today's historians, both Christian and non-Christian, agreed that something happened to convince the disciples they'd seen Jesus after his death. So, what did the disciples see and experience? Well, in the rational 21st century, I guess it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics, our own personal experience all tell us that people just don't come back to life again after they die. So we might think, surely there's some other explanation. Well, what we'll do now is look at some of the more common alternative explanations and see how they sit with the evidence we have for what happened. Okay, right, so one explanation could be it's pretty easy to appear to your disciples after your death if you didn't die in the first place. So was Jesus really executed? Could he have been taken down off the cross before he died, then revived later? At first glance, that doesn't look too implausible. We've all heard that people have been pronounced dead, then to everyone's surprise, revived some hours or days later in a mortuary or hospital, like this fella here. That's a chap called Walter Williams. He died in Alabama in 2014. He was in the mortuary on that gurney with that body bag over the top of him, and the mortician heard a scratching under the body bag. He unzipped the body bag, and there's Walter Williams recovering in hospital. So if this kind of thing can happen occasionally today, what about 2,000 years ago when medical knowledge was more primitive? Could the Romans who executed Jesus have made a mistake? Alternatively, what if the whole thing was faked? What if the crucifixion was somehow stage managed as some form of diversion to allow Jesus to escape? Well, in response, consider the following. Historians and archaeologists can tell us quite a lot about Roman torture and execution techniques. I won't go into the gory details here. There are plenty of internet sites, TV programs about this very subject if you're interested. But what our knowledge of Roman torture and execution tells us is that it was very, very unlikely that anyone survived a Roman crucifixion. Now, we know of one or two other examples from other historical sources that this had happened, it could happen, but it was a very, very rare occurrence. And if you think of this, even if Jesus could have been taken down before he died and the nails taken out of his wrists and feet, he'd have been unable to use his hands and he wouldn't have been able to walk. It's very unlikely he would have ever made a full recovery. Also, he wasn't executed by amateurs. Roman soldiers did the job. Now, they might not have had 21st century medical knowledge. They knew exactly how to kill somebody. That's what they were trained to do. They were professional career killers. Also, he was executed in the orders of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. Now, one argument goes that the soldiers had been bribed by persons unknown not to kill Jesus. Instead, they were to stage manage a fake execution. Firstly, that would have been kind of difficult, as it was a public crucifixion, as all crucifixions were. That was the whole point, to act as a warning to others not to disturb the Roman order. Secondly, if that had been found out, the soldiers would have disobeyed a direct command from the Roman ruler of Judea. A slow and painful death would have been the inevitable result. Also, the sources we discussed earlier all agree that Jesus was tortured and flogged before he was crucified. So, in short, just suppose he was able to survive the crucifixion. Just suppose there was some plot to get him off the cross. What kind of condition would he have been in? Hardly an impressive sight for the disciples a few days later. Hardly an inspiration for the disciples then to go and spread the message of a risen Christ triumphing over death throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. So, in summary, it's highly unlikely that Jesus survived his crucifixion. It's also highly unlikely the whole thing was stage managed either. However, as you may be aware, the fake crucifixion theory has had some popular currency in the last few years. And if you've read the book or seen the film of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, you know that one theory is that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Instead, he escaped to southern France along with his wife, Mary Magdalene. In southern France, their children intermarry with the Merovingians, thus creating a holy bloodline that the Catholic Church has been trying to suppress ever since. Now, that theory is based on an earlier book by Bagent, Lee, and Lincoln called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. There's the book up in the top right-hand corner of the slide. Now, we can spend some time going over the pros and cons of this theory. However, that will be going over ground well covered in the books, the reviews of the books and articles written on the subject currently available. Instead, I think I can say that this theory is just that, a theory. Now, while there are historically factual elements to that theory, other facts are ignored. There's also a large amount of speculation required to arrive at the conclusions the books and film make. Now, if that's an area of interest to you, my suggestion would be to read the reviews of the books and articles on the subject. Frankly, a simple Google search will get you going. A review of those items, I think you'll find demonstrate why this theory really has no serious takers amongst the overwhelming majority of today's historians. Okay, so it would look most likely that Jesus was executed. But what happened to his dead body? Well, that's important to consider. Clearly, it would have been difficult to explain Jesus being alive after his death if his corpse was still in the tomb. The gospel account is he was executed, he was prepared for burial, and he was placed in a rock cave tomb. On the third day after his death, some of his female followers went to the tomb. They found the tomb open and Jesus' body missing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, although the documentary evidence in the Gospels seems to vary in some of the details, this event is present in all four Gospels. Clearly, early Christians believed that his body had disappeared from earth so that he could come back alive again to his followers. However, are there any other explanations why his body might have been missing? Well, perhaps the best way of approaching this is to look for a motive. Who could have removed the body from the tomb, and what would their motive be for doing that? Well, I suppose the Romans could have, and I suppose the Romans' main concern was maintaining order in Jerusalem. Their motivation for executing Jesus, as we've seen from E.P. Sanders' list, was in direct response to the disturbance Jesus had created in the temple area. That disturbance created the unrest the Romans were always seeking to avoid in this very volatile part of their empire. Now, Jesus had some very devoted followers. Perhaps the Romans were concerned that by leaving Jesus' body in the tomb, it would become a shrine to Jesus and a focal point for further unrest. Now, that line of thought does have some modern parallels. For example, at the end of the Second World War, the Russian army discovered Hitler's dead body in his burned-out bunker in Berlin. However, they destroyed the body completely so that it could not be buried. Their concern was that Hitler's grave would become a focal point for Nazi sympathizers in the future. However, what undermines that theory is that very shortly after Jesus' death, his followers are going around saying that he's risen from the dead. They're making a nuisance of themselves and causing the very disorder the Romans were trying to avoid. Indeed, the Romans spent the next 300 odd years trying to suppress the disorder that developed through the Roman Empire as a result of that one event. So, to nip it all in the bud, to stop it all getting out of hand, if the Romans had taken Jesus' body, would they not have produced it? Now, as I said in the first half, a common fate for corpses of crucifixion victims was they were thrown in the municipal rubbish dump outside of Jerusalem, where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. Now, if that's what the Romans had done with Jesus' body, they mightn't have had it to produce. However, it would have been a relatively simple thing to publicly state that's what had happened to the body. However, we get no direct evidence or even hints of evidence that anything like that actually happened. So I think we have to conclude it's unlikely the Romans were responsible for the empty tomb. Well, what about the Jewish authorities? Well, I think their motive for taking the body and the counter-arguments are pretty much the same as the Romans. Well, what about the disciples? Would they have a motive for taking Jesus' body from the tomb? I think this also would look to be unlikely. I personally can't think of a motive they might have for doing that. Also, the disciples believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and were prepared to die for that belief. In most cases, they did die for that belief. If they had taken the body, well, why would they make up the raised from the dead story and be prepared to die in defense of it? It just doesn't make any sense. Now, what about grave robbers? Now, to me, the idea that grave robbers stole Jesus' body looks like more of a possibility. Grave robbing did occur at that time. Robbers were looking for the valuable goods sometimes buried with a body. In fewer cases, they were looking for the body itself or the body parts for use in magic rituals. Well, was there anything to steal? Well, the Synoptic Gospels, that's the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mention that Jesus' body was wrapped tightly in a linen cloth. No grave goods are mentioned. Grave robbers usually steal the goods buried with a body, not the decomposing body itself. Now, John's Gospel mentions about 34 kilograms of myrrh and aloes that were wrapped tightly into the linen cloth round Jesus' body. That would have been worth stealing. However, John's Gospel also tells us that Jesus' grave clothes were in the tomb with the burial cloth neatly folded when the disciples entered the tomb and found Jesus' body missing. Now that doesn't fit with the grave robbing theory. If you're robbing a grave of spices wrapped tightly into the linen binding around a dead body, it would make sense to take the body somewhere else, unwrap the body, take the spices. or do exactly the same thing in the tomb. Unwrap the body, take the spices. In the first scenario, there would have been no body or grave clothes in the tomb. The second scenario, there would have been a body and the grave clothes in the tomb. Neither situation described in John's Gospel. Now, we know from a few Roman and Greek sources that dead human bodies or body parts were sometimes used in magic rituals around the Roman Empire. However, the practice wasn't rife, and we've no evidence this occurred within the Jewish part of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Jews would find that kind of behaviour abhorrent. This burial that occurred in Jerusalem, the most Jewish of Jewish towns and cities. That makes the concept of a stolen body for the purposes of magic even less likely than if the burial that occurred in, say, Rome or Athens or Alexandria or somewhere like that. So nobody seems to have a particularly strong motive for taking the body or keeping it a secret if they did. Now, one final point I think is worth making on this subject. The disciples of Jesus were the founders of what we know as Christianity. After the resurrection, they didn't go to some obscure place miles away from where it all happened to preach about the resurrection. No, they came back to Jerusalem, the very place of Jesus' execution and tomb. Fundamental to their preaching was the empty tomb of Jesus. If this preaching had been false, it would have been clearly evident to the people of Jerusalem. Some people were bound to know where Jesus' tomb was or what had happened to the body. Indeed, Jesus was buried in the tomb of a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, that's the Jewish ruling council. That's Joseph of Arimathea. So somebody would be bound to know where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was. So in conclusion, I suppose we can't say there's any concrete evidence to demonstrate that Jesus' body left earth as the disciples claimed. However, what is clearer is that his body disappeared, and that those with a vested interest in claiming it was still on earth, that is the Romans, the temple authorities, couldn't prove it actually was. Okay, was Jesus seen alive by his followers? As you saw at the start of this part of the presentation, I mentioned E.P. Sanders' secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As we saw, Sanders says this because historians are of the majority view that Jesus' disciples saw him after his death. I guess what historians are less certain about is the in what sense part of the statement. So what do the Gospels and letters of Paul say? Well, there's more than one appearance in the Bible. There are 11 separate and distinct appearance events described. They happen to individuals, groups of people, and in one case, 500 people. These happen over a period of 40 days after Jesus' death, with the exception of his appearance to Paul, which happened much later. The Gospels are clear that Jesus was with them physically. He could eat, drink, be touched, and be conversed with. But he could also appear and disappear at will. Often in the appearance events, the disciples don't seem to immediately recognize the person they're with as Jesus. So as I said earlier, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying, coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics, our own personal experience all tell us that people just don't come back to life again after they die. So, are there any other possible explanations for what the disciples saw other than the risen Christ? Well, did they see a ghost? I think for us in the rational 21st century, this is probably a bit as difficult to grasp as seeing the resurrected Jesus. However, the descriptions of a physical Jesus that could eat, drink, and be touched doesn't sound like a spectral appearance. Okay, did they? Were they subject to some form of hysteria? Now, the followers of Jesus would have been distraught after his death. That can make people a bit irrational and unstable. Is it possible that seeing Jesus alive again was all in their minds, some sort of mass hallucination, some sort of fevered imagination, some sort of wish fulfillment? Well, in response, our knowledge of psychology tells us that hallucinations are individual occurrences. They can't happen to groups of people at the same time. So I could be standing up here having a hallucination. I'm not, by the way, but I could be having a hallucination, but you can't have it. It's purely personal to me. You can stick the word mass and hallucination next to each other in a sentence and get the phrase mass hallucination. It can exist in a sentence. It can't exist in real life. Now, having said that, you can just about imagine a situation where a small group of people grieving in a room together might work themselves up into such an emotional frenzy that they were able to convince each other they saw the person they were grieving over. Could any of the appearance events fit with something like that? Well, if I'm honest, the circumstances of one or two could, although if I'm also honest, there's nothing in the sources hinting that anything like that actually happened. For the rest, the actual appearance events in the Gospels just don't fit with some form of hysterical event. For example, two disciples are walking to a village called Emmaus in broad daylight. They're chatting when suddenly Jesus appears with them. The disciples are out catching fish in the Sea of Galilee. As they come ashore, Jesus is waiting for them and has cooked breakfast for them. In another, Jesus appears to more than 500 people at the same time. As I mentioned before, there are 11 separate appearance events in the documentary evidence we've got. When these are studied and dissected, there's little or no evidence to suggest that hysteria played a part in the appearance events experienced by the disciples. Okay, well, did the disciples just make it all up? As I mentioned before, nearly all the disciples met violent deaths proclaiming Jesus as the risen Son of God. They just wouldn't have done that if they'd made the whole thing up. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, today's historians, that's Christian historians and non-Christian ones, specialising in first century Near Eastern history, are of the majority view that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. Well, in what sense did they see Jesus? Well, it's unlikely they saw a ghost. It's unlikely they suffered some form of hysterical event. And it's unlikely they made it all up. As I said a few times, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Pretty implausible. It just doesn't happen. But historians tell us that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. We've looked at various explanations for this. By deduction, it would seem that the least unlikely explanation is that they actually saw Jesus alive after his death. By deduction, the other explanations just look even more implausible than that. Okay. Is there any other evidence? So, analysis of the evidence we've looked at so far points to the resurrection being an actual historical event. However, is there any other evidence we should consider? Well, I think the answer is a clear yes. Consider the following. Now, we covered this a few minutes ago. Let's consider this in a bit more detail. So what, you might say? Countless people have died for their beliefs since the disciples. For thousands of years, people have been enthusiastically dying for what they sincerely believe in. From the suffragette Emily Davison to the IRA's Bobby Sands to the suicide bombers of Iraq, Israel and Afghanistan to the terrorists involved in the London tube bombings to the Jews of the Spanish Inquisition. These are just a few of the countless numbers of people who have died for the sincerely held beliefs since the disciples. However, there's one key difference with the disciples. The disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had died, and they had personally met him after his death. They sincerely believed they had personally conversed with him, eaten with him, and touched him. And they were prepared to die for that belief. What they weren't prepared to die for was an ideology or set of beliefs passed on to them from some political or religious leader. Now, later, Christian martyrs could possibly fit into that category. I'm probably being unfair, but they could potentially fit into that category. However, with Jesus' disciples, it's different. They were prepared to die and did die because they had personally seen Jesus alive after his death. That points clearly to the disciples having actually seen Jesus alive. Another piece of circumstantial evidence is the conversion of skeptics. Now, two of the early leaders in the very early days of Christianity, two of the early leaders of the way, as the early Christians called themselves, were people who had been unconvinced that Jesus was the Son of God. Earlier on, we heard about Paul, as when he was called Saul, he was a persecutor of Christians. What changed him to becoming a follower of Jesus was meeting him alive on the road to Damascus sometime after his death. Now, the other former skeptic we know of is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, Jesus wasn't an only child. He had a number of brothers and sisters. His whole family, including his mother, initially tried to stop him in his mission. In Mark's gospel, his whole family, presumably James included, come to get him. Mark says, when his whole family heard about this, his teaching that is, they went to take charge of him. For they said he's out of his mind. That's Mark chapter 3, verse 20. Now, James isn't mentioned as a follower of Jesus in the Gospels. Yet in the early church, James is a leading figure. Well, why the change? Well, we're told in Paul's letters that James too had seen Jesus alive after his death. James changed from being a skeptic to a believer after seeing the risen Christ. Another piece of circumstantial evidence, probably the best way of looking at this, some changes to key social structures. I guess the best way of thinking about this is, ask yourself the question, why are there Jews around today? Jews can trace their origins back to the tribal Middle East of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. There were other people around at that time. Why is it then there are no people alive today who would call themselves Babylonians, Ammonites, Assyrians, Hittites, and so on? Well, the answer, I think in part, is the social and religious structures that make Jews Jews. Jewish people have lived side by side with non-Jews for the last 2,000 years, but have remained distinctly different because of their own customs, laws, eating habits, religious practices, religious beliefs, and so on. To Jews, these are the things that make them who they are and are terribly important to them. Now, some have viewed the early Christians as just another Jewish sect, and in a sense they were. However, they were different from those other Jewish sects that existed at that time. Those other sects didn't disagree on the fundamentals of Judaism. The first Christians were all Jews. Excuse me. We've got clear evidence that early after Jesus' death, these Jewish Christians rejected many of the foundations of Judaism. An enormous social leap, and one that brought with it great personal risk to their own lives. We've also got evidence that these changes weren't made lightly or easily by the Jewish Christians. So what were these changes? Well, they stopped offering animal sacrifice. They eventually rejected belief that keeping Moses' laws, not the Ten Commandments, but the other eating, social, and sacrifice laws that Jews believed was the way to be right with God. They changed their Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. They believed in a Trinity, that's one God in three forms. That was blasphemy to the Jews. They believed the Messiah had come. Jews were and are still waiting. And they initiated the new ritual of the Lord's Supper, a ritual that celebrates Jesus' victory over death. So why did the early Jewish Christians make these changes? Because the leaders had seen Jesus alive after his death, remembered his teachings, and were therefore compelled to make these changes. Okay, the emergence of Christianity is another piece of circumstantial evidence. Earlier we talked about how quickly after Jesus' death, Christianity caught hold and spread through the Roman world. Well, why did that happen? Equally importantly, why did Christianity survive, particularly when other religious fads we're aware of that existed in the Roman world didn't survive? Why didn't Christianity fizzle out after a few decades? Well, the answer is the resurrection. A core of people witnessed Jesus alive after his death. The sources tell us that this core of people were transformed from illiterate fishermen, Jewish zealots, tax collectors, and other ordinary people into tireless advocates for the risen Jesus. As we saw earlier from E.P. Sanders' books, the disciples formed a community to await Jesus' return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. They did all that because of the resurrection. Without the resurrection, there would have been no lasting Christianity. Frankly, without the resurrection, we wouldn't be here this afternoon. So I started by making two statements. There's a historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God. And there's a wealth of evidence to support that view. To end, let's review what we've covered this afternoon. We stated that the Gospels and most of the letters of Paul are likely to provide an accurate account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. We stated that the view of today's historians is that these documents have been, on the whole, accurately preserved for us and haven't been subject to accidental or deliberate modification. We reviewed the other historical information that was contemporary to, but out with the Gospels. That provided information that didn't contradict what was in the Gospels and letters of Paul. We presented evidence demonstrating that it was very likely that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God. We suggested it was very unlikely that he saw himself in that way due to some psychological condition. And we also suggested that when the sources are reviewed, there's no evidence to suggest that either Jesus deliberately misled or unintentionally misled his followers. We presented evidence demonstrating it was very likely that Jesus was executed and died. We presented evidence that it was very likely he was buried and that shortly afterwards his tomb was found to be empty. And we looked at possible reasons for the tomb being empty. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that his body was no longer on earth. We looked at the historical basis for Jesus' appearance to his disciples. We found that this is regarded as a secure fact by most historians. And we reviewed what it was the disciples saw. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that the disciples saw, met, talked with, and ate with Jesus in bodily form after his death. Lastly, we looked at circumstantial evidence for the resurrection. We suggested that without the resurrection, it's likely that the disciples wouldn't have died for their beliefs. Skeptics like Paul and James would not have been converted. A clear separation of Jewish Christians and Judaism would not have occurred. The church would not have emerged and spread so quickly. Christianity would not have lasted to this day. Okay. History is sometimes not an exact discipline. We can sometimes have difficulty saying with absolute certainty that something happened in a particular time and it happened in a particular way. Even today, with mass communication, controversy can rage relating to events that happened last week or a few years ago. For example, John F. Kennedy's assassination, Princess Diana's death, the Twin Towers, and so on. And I suppose it's the same with Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I can't say with absolute certainty that the evidence I presented is 100% correct. I can't say with absolute certainty based on this that Jesus is the Son of God. But I think what I can do, I think I can say that Jesus being the Son of God is the most likely explanation of the pretty extensive evidence that we've got. What I think I can say is that looked at rationally, the alternative explanations for the evidence are just simply far less likely. Okay, now I'm sure some of you might be agreeing with this. I'm also sure that some of you will be thinking, isn't this a bit one-sided? Christian presents evidence for Christianity in church setting. Surely there's another point of view. Frankly, if I'd been sitting where you are when I was an agnostic, that's exactly what I'd be thinking. I did think that. However, my spiritual journey didn't end by reading The Case for Christ and a few Christian histories on the life of Jesus. I also trawled bookshops for books on atheism. I felt sure I'd find some atheistic stuff that would blow all this out the water. I scoured atheist websites, I read detailed hostile reviews of The Case for Christ, I listened to and read books and articles by atheists. Blooming depressing, but I still do it. I read the New Testament for myself. I read biographies and critiques of Jesus by non-Christians. And frankly, I'd encourage anyone with doubts about the material presented to do exactly the same. And what was the result of all that research? Well, I think I can summarise that by saying I was an agnostic then, I'm a Christian now. Okay. What we haven't discussed is Jesus' message and what it means. What we haven't discussed is why Jesus' message is important to you today. You may or may not be glad to know I'm not going to start now. However, consider this. If Jesus is the Son of God, if Jesus is real, then his message is real too. In the last 2,000 years, countless lives have been positively transformed by a relationship with Jesus Christ and Jesus' message. Don't kid yourselves. If you truly accept Jesus' message, and I'm stressing the words, truly accept Jesus' message, it's always a positive transformation. So, in conclusion, do you not owe it to yourselves to weigh up the evidence and decide what you think? And if you do that and decide that Jesus is real, do you not owe it to yourselves to find out what his message is and start to experience that positive transformation that our relationship with Jesus Christ will provide you? Thank you.